John Talty, CBS Sports, joins us on 365 Sports. John, thanks for your patience. We appreciate your time. The story, he and Dennis Dodd, the Big Ten's weaponization of clean cash and lots of it, shifting power dynamics from the South to the North. Do we have enough analytics, data, whatever, for that to be the case, or do we still need to maybe see, John, another year or two?
Yeah, I think it's the start of something. I think you need, like you said, probably a little bit more time to know whether this is a full trend or not. Certainly, we saw a very long run of SEC success. We saw the Big Ten win last year. Was listening to you guys talk. Seems like you probably think Big Ten's going to win Monday night as well as I do. It's 2 in a row. We'll see kind of where it goes from there. But, we're in a unique moment, I think, right now in college football. And I think as we detail in the story, money is critically important. And it's the donor money, which is very important. And it's also the money that you're going to bring in, through TV rights and ticket sales and all that. And, the Big Ten is well positioned in both of those areas. And it has been for a while, and it hasn't always led to success. But it feels like there is more of a direct correlation right now between having the most money and having success on the field. Again, as you guys know, it doesn't always work that way in pro sports and others. There's all kinds of different ways that can kind of go off the rails, but that feels very important right now in college sports. And the Big Ten and others, SEC, of course, isn't going away, but the Big Ten right now in particular feels, really well positioned for this current era of college sports.
Which team that is not Ohio State and Michigan, Penn State, that has this cash do you think will? Because one of the things, I remember hearing in the, like all the realignment debates about who, really deserves the TV money or whatever was, okay, well, you have a school like Clemson, say, that doesn't have as much money, but they put most of their effort into football. And then you could have a school like, say, Purdue that puts most of their effort into basketball. Is there a school that you've seen now changing their efforts around football more because, like you said, the clean cash is there now?
I think Indiana is a great potential example of that, right? Whereas historically, obviously, one of the blue bloods of college basketball, and you would think that that's where you want to invest your money. Whereas let's look at where they are right now. Football team makes playoff run. They've got a great coach in Curt Cignetti, coach of the year, and some of the different things that those awards. And then on the flip side, basketball is not going very well. You got chance at recent games to fire Mike Woodson. And so do you, maybe put a little bit more of the money from a rev share standpoint on the football side, whereas that went in the basketball in the past? Something everybody's got to figure out. This is a Southern school, but I think another good example of that is UNC. And I did some reporting on this in the past. And, different coaching candidates that were up for that job got told different things for what the NIL and rev share money might look like for football. I think because of who Bill Belichick is and his ability to generate attention and I think down the line generate money specifically for football, I could see football getting a bigger share than it would have gotten in the past, where, again, UNC, traditional basketball powerhouse. So you're seeing some of that adjustment happening. But it is an interesting, I think, question, because there are some schools where it's very easy to know, okay, we're a basketball school, let's devote more of the money there. We're a football school, let's devote more of the money there. When you're really good at both, that's where it gets kind of tricky, where, if you're only, say, devoting $2-3 million in rev share to basketball, that's not going to get it done at where we know those numbers are getting at the upper ends of basketball. Flip side, if you're only maybe working with 10 million in football and other people in your conference are working with 15, 16 million just from rev share, puts you at a pretty big disadvantage. So all those schools are going to have to kind of weigh that and try to keep everybody happy. And in some ways, only being good at one makes it at least an easier decision moving forward.
By the way, if you haven't read the story, it's CBS, again, Sports, John Talty and Dennis Dodd, the Big Ten's weaponization of clean cash, and lots of it, is shifting power dynamics from the South to the North. You mentioned Indiana. I saw a quote, I think, from the head coach at Maryland. These are schools that are not known, as you mentioned, so much for football. Does this even allow them to gain better depth as if they don't already have it in that conference?
It could, and I think that's what we're seeing. In some ways, I think the challenge that the SEC went through this past year is that it had better depth, but I think it hurt some of the upper end of the kind of what we're used to, the powers of the SEC, and that's Alabama, Georgia, teams like that. I feel like we saw them, come a little closer to earth, and I think you saw schools like South Carolina and Missouri and other Ole Miss that have invested heavily in NIL close that gap a little bit. It felt like it brought some of them down and moved some up, and it created, I think, a really top to bottom, very strong league, but not quite as maybe as of elite teams as we're used to seeing in the SEC in the past. I think the Big Ten, there was more of a gap this past year between you had some really top teams. You already mentioned a couple of them: Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, of course, Indiana. The rest of the conference, there are a couple of good teams, some at the bottom, but school like Maryland, as you mentioned, Purdue, there's some others that were not operating anywhere close to the upper end of NIL money. And so, we know Ohio State publicly talking about how they've spent $20 million on their roster. Oregon's in a similar space as that. That's the top end. Maryland, I think, was a quarter of that. And there are other programs in the Big Ten that were similar. If rev share happens next year, like we expect, this year in the summer, that gives them a lot more money to play with that they haven't had in the past. So in theory, kind of like we're seeing in the SEC, you could see some of that kind of talent gap shrink a bit as a lot of money floods the market. And we've written about it at CBS and 24/7. Decent amount at this point, but there's just a lot of money flooding the market. It's why you're seeing huge numbers for QBs and other players. And I think a big part of that are some of these smaller, or maybe less affluent programs having more money to have at their disposal than they had in a long time, really being aggressive and trying to add talent. And that's, driving up the prices on everybody.
John, how do you think that the Big 12 and ACC try and close the gap? Revenue sharing could kind of help that a little bit, because then they can, it'll hurt paying coaches, but it won't hurt paying the athletes. How do they close that gap, though, when you've got somebody with such a big lead on you right now?
Yeah, I think there's two questions there. One, are you going to fully fund the rev share, right? That is, I think, a bit more of a question for certain programs within those two conferences. I think ultimately everybody's probably going to have to get there. But, I think SEC, Big Ten, we expect all of them to do it. I know there's already a couple that, might get close. I think it was Houston recently that said they were going to get more in the 17 to $18 million range, which is still, a lot of money, but not quite at that full 20 and a half number that we expect. So that's going to be a question, for each individual school. Do you have the money and the revenue to be able to do, that number? And important to keep in mind that number is going to go up as time goes on. So it's going to get more and more expensive, just the way we see in the NBA and NFL when they get new TV rights deals and things like that. Cap goes up accordingly as more revenue comes in. So that's something they're going to have to figure out. And then I think you have to be creative in finding different ways. Like if it's a pure money game, as it stands right now, the ACC and Big 12 are always going to be at a disadvantage. It's just the SEC and Big 10 have more money. That's going to continue to happen moving forward. So you've got to find different ways, whether it's generating revenue differently or just how you build your roster. I mean, we saw Arizona State have a lot of success this past year. That was not a NIL heavy program. We're seeing them try to reinvest after the year they had. They talk about activating the Valley, trying to get that that Phoenix area on board with them. That could be an advantage for Arizona State moving forward. But in a pure money battle, they're not going to win. So you've got to find different ways to do it. And again, let's go back to pro sports. Moneyball never fully worked for the A's, but they were good for a lot of years. I'm a pretty big baseball fan. We've seen the Rays have a lot of success. Now, I don't know that we've seen a team, I guess the Royals maybe fully break through and win it all with that model. But there are different ways to put together organizations that focus on different things rather than solely the most amount of money. Otherwise, the Yankees or Mets or Dodgers would win every World Series.
What's interesting about the Rays, the Royals, as you mentioned, and the A's for the longest time is that they have great personnel people making decisions and picks and stuff like that. It's just they can't keep up with the second level of when they have to keep the younger player, right?
Exactly. And so, in some way you could say, well, that's going to be an NFL problem. But as we stand right now, we'll see what happens. There's so many big things kind of floating around college sports right now that there are solutions that could fix a lot of these problems. But where that exact problem is happening right now is you might find a guy who is underrated, really good, and after a year of success, a bigger program is going to tamper with him and offer him way more money than you can, and then he's gone. So right now in baseball, you can sign a guy to 4, 5, 6, sometimes longer contracts. You can hold on to them for a while. You can manipulate whether you keep them in the minors or the majors. There's different ways to hold on to guys a little longer. As it stands right now, there's no way to do that because these guys aren't under binding contracts. So, there's I'm here in Alabama. There are a couple guys at South Alabama this past year that were really good, great finds by South Alabama. Guess what? They're gone, and they got significantly more money in the portal to go to Kansas State, and I think another one was Mississippi State. And so that's the real challenge, that even if you find that diamond in the rough, can you hold on to him? And it's happening a lot in college basketball too. We're seeing a lot of guys who are very good mid-major players get offered double, triple, quadruple amount of money, and they end up in a Power 4 spot the next year. So until there's some sort of contracts to keep guys, that's always the risk. And that's, unfortunately, one of the concerning things if you're one of those smaller programs is that even if you figure it all out, how do you hold on to those guys? It's very hard to do.
Can you tell everybody what the heck that instrument is behind you? Is that the fireplace? That's a machine. What is that? For those who don't know what that is.
Typewriter. We don't see those often. Trying to throw back to the old days. To be perfectly honest, I have not used it much. But every once in a while, I send out a typewritten letter. That's probably not a lot of them going out anymore. But yeah, it's an homage to how things used to be.
Yeah, I loved it. I wish I would have kept one before I threw all of mine eventually away for a laptop or computer whenever either one of them happened. And then you wrote that book on Nick Saban. I remember that. We had you on during that time. He seems to be enjoying himself, John. Did you ever think he would fall into that so easily like he has and so effortlessly?
I've always thought he would be great at media because he's so good at explaining things that are very complicated into digestible, easily understandable kind of bits of information. And that, I think, is also why he was such a great coach, was that able to take complicated defensive concepts and explain it to 18-year-old kids and get them to figure it out. So I always knew he'd be great at kind of the football side of things. What I don't think any of us maybe could have expected is just like how much fun he's been, how much he's embraced that side of things. There are always rumors of him being fun, right? There's rumors of him having a good sense of humor and all that. We saw bits and pieces of it over the years, but I don't think I ever could have imagined him putting on a Nittany Lions costume on game day. That to me is a step beyond anything I could have imagined. It seems like he's had a lot of fun with it. He's fit in very seamlessly into it. And I think he's been great. I mean, he has surpassed even my expectations for him. I think he's been a great addition, and I think he's definitely given that program some real juice. It was feeling a little stale there for a moment. I think he's really elevated it in a lot of ways.
I think Pat McAfee and Saban, when that McAfee has loosened him up a little bit, and I think that Saban has also helped McAfee kind of understand what he does a little bit better, that he did have a sense of humor, and doesn't mean he was this iron-fisted dictator, although at some point he was that when he was a coach too.
Yeah, I think it's what you see is that they have really good chemistry. And I think, you go back to more than a year ago, I guess 2 years ago, really, Saban started doing these weekly appearances on McAfee's show. And, at that time, I did think it was to set up a media future because it felt like we're getting closer to the end there. And, whether that is exactly what it was or not, it certainly seems to have helped those two guys build a good rapport. I do think McAfee, even when Saban was still a coach, McAfee, he just has this way about him where he can ask these questions that literally none of the rest of us could without getting our heads, chewed off. And he's able to deliver in a way that kind of puts Saban at ease, and Saban answers questions that he would not otherwise answer. That I think has been very illuminating. I feel like we've learned a lot about Saban, maybe just this kind of last year or two of him being more media friendly and telling some of his stories. And I think it's been exciting to kind of get that side of him. Where again, talked to enough players over the years. I wrote a book about him that I feel like I had a pretty good sense of who this guy is. And you would hear from his players, he has these moments of being very funny, but I think it's been great for the overall college football, I think, fan audience to see this other side of him. And you guys can remember, I mean, it was probably 10, 15 years ago where everybody thought he was a robot and the devil. Yep. And I mean, he's come a long way from being a guy that I think all of college football hated to being this kind of beloved elder statesman role that he's in now.
Yeah, I agree. And I saw that when I saw the weekly show he would do at that restaurant, that you could see that human side of him, unless you're Shane Gillis and you want to kind of have a little bit too much fun about how Alabama was acquiring all their talent. He kind of barked back at that one, didn't he?
I got to be careful. I don't want to get Coach Saban mad at me now. But, I mean, I wouldn't say Shane was wrong about what he was saying. I mean, I pushed it a little too far. But, there's a way of doing things. And that's, we didn't really get too much into it for our story because you got to be careful. I'm not trying to get sued or anything like that. But it wasn't limited to the SEC. There are other schools that, of course, did it. SMU famously, there are plenty. But there was a way of doing things, right, where there was money exchanged long before NIL, and I think the numbers were smaller. There was a very, organized way of doing it, and that advantage has kind of gone away. And I think that's a part of what we're seeing right now too. The 10,000, 20,000 here, those numbers are now 200,000, 300,000. Like the money has quadrupled, if not even more, from how things used to be, even from when I started covering recruiting, 15, 20 years ago. So there's some of that I think is also changing the college football landscape right now as well.
Thank you, John. Great stuff. You and Dennis, the tag team on the story and also the book on Saban and what you're doing. CBS Sports, 247 Sports. John Talty with us on 365 Sports.